Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're stepping into one of the coldest, harshest moments in New York City's history. The Great Blizzard of 1888. Imagine waking up one morning, and the world outside your window is gone, buried. The streets, the rooftops, the bridges, even the noise of the city. Everything drowned under mountains of snow and the roar of howling winds. That's what happened to New Yorkers more than a century ago. And tonight, I'm going to take you there, step by step, moment by moment. If you find this journey fascinating, don't forget to give the video a like and hit follow so you don't miss the next chapters of history's most chilling stories. Now, let's go back in time. Picture New York in March 1888. It wasn't yet the city of skyscrapers and neon signs, but it was already alive, bustling, crowded with immigrants, merchants, streetcars, and ferries pulling in and out of the harbor. The city was noisy, chaotic, and proud. Horse-drawn carriages clattered along cobblestones. Shopkeepers shouted to customers from their stalls. Children played stickball in alleys. And ferries carried thousands of workers across the East River every day. It was the heartbeat of America's future, restless and unstoppable. But weather doesn't care about progress. Weather doesn't care about pride. And in March of that year, nature struck in a way that no one was prepared for. The storm came almost without warning. On March 11th, skies darkened. The wind began to whip harder than usual, and rain turned quickly to sleet, then to snow. People thought it was just another winter squall. They had seen plenty before, but this was different. By nightfall, the snow fell heavier and faster. By midnight, it was a blinding curtain, slamming into windows, choking the streets, and driving people indoors. The temperature dropped so fast that water pipes cracked, horses collapsed in their tracks, and ferry boats froze in the middle of the river, trapped by ice. By dawn, New York City was no longer New York City. It was something else, a frozen labyrinth, a silent, white wilderness where every familiar landmark had been swallowed. Entire trains were trapped on the tracks. Telegraph wires snapped and dangled uselessly in the snow. Bridges were nearly impossible to cross. The mighty Brooklyn Bridge, barely 5 years old at the time, stood coated in ice, its cables groaning against the gale. Imagine the fear of families who had sent loved ones out the day before and now had no idea if they were alive. Trapped somewhere in that storm. Phones weren't there yet. Electricity wasn't reliable. Information traveled at the speed of footsteps, or not at all. People huddled together, waiting, wondering, clinging to candles and stoves that struggled against the cold, seeping through every crack. And the snow just kept falling, hour after hour, piling higher, drifting against doors and windows, climbing past the knees, the waist, the chest of anyone daring to step outside. Reports say drifts reached as high as rooftops. Some homes and shops were completely buried, their doors vanished behind white walls. To step into the street was to gamble with your life, because the wind alone could knock you down, bury you, or drive you into frozen blindness. But here's the thing, out of every disaster comes stories. And in 1888, those stories are what keep this blizzard alive in our imagination. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other before found themselves digging paths together, sharing scraps of food, or keeping watch through the night, to make sure fires didn't go out. Strangers pulled one another from snowbanks. Sailors risked their lives to keep ships from splintering against icy piers. Families told stories to their children to distract them from the sound of windows rattling and walls creaking under the storm's force. It wasn't just a storm. It was a test. A test of the city's endurance, of human resilience, of what it really means to survive together. Think about it. This blizzard shut down New York in a way that no strike, no riot, no economic crash ever could. The streets were impassable. The elevated trains were frozen solid. The ferries were locked in ice. People couldn't get to work, to markets, to hospitals. Hundreds of lives were lost across the Northeast, and many of them were right here in New York City. Yet, in that silence, in that whiteout, New Yorkers found something too. They found the strength of community, the warmth of humanity in the coldest of nights. And that's what makes the Great Blizzard of 1888 unforgettable. It wasn't only about snow and wind. It was about people. How they endured, how they helped, how they remembered. Tonight, we're going to walk with them into the streets buried chest deep in snow, onto the rooftops weighed down with ice, into the harbors where frozen ferries sat trapped like ghosts. We'll see what they saw, feel what they felt, and hear how the city that never sleeps was forced to bow its head under nature's power. Because if you really want to know New York, if you want to understand its spirit, you can't just look at the shining towers of today. You have to go back to those moments when everything stopped, when survival itself became the story. And it begins here, with the storm of March 1888. Before the storm hit with its full fury, New Yorkers thought they were ready for anything. After all, winter was no stranger here. Families kept coal stacked in cellars, merchants stored firewood behind their shops, and every street corner had children who could build a snow fort faster than you could say, "Storm's coming." Life in 1888 was tough, but adaptable. People dressed in wool coats, leather boots, and heavy scarves. They carried umbrellas through sleet, braved the wind on ferries, and trudged through mud without much complaint. But the early days of March carried whispers, subtle signs that something unusual was brewing. Temperatures dipped lower than expected, the wind grew sharper, and sailors in the harbor muttered that the air smelled like ice. Few paid attention. Why would they? New York was alive with its usual energy. Streetcars rattled up and down Broadway, vendors shouted over one another in markets, and the hum of industry kept everyone focused on progress, not the weather. Then came March 11th. At first, just rain, nothing alarming. Shoppers held their hats against the drizzle, and workers hurried to catch ferries across the East River. But by afternoon, that rain hardened into sleet, sharp pellets, stinging faces, and turning streets into slick mirrors. By nightfall, the sleet gave way to heavy snow, and suddenly the city seemed to change shape. Gas lamps glowed dim behind curtains of white. Carriages slipped on cobblestones. Horses strained against icy harnesses, their breath steaming like smoke engines in the cold. People still thought it would pass by morning. They went to bed believing they'd wake to a dusting of snow, maybe enough for children to cheer about. But what they found instead was a nightmare. By dawn on March 12th, New York was buried. Not covered, buried. Snow didn't fall in gentle flakes. It hurled down in sheets, driven by winds so fierce they bent signposts and slammed shutters against walls. Drifts climbed past windows, choking alleyways, and piling so high that doors wouldn't open. Families woke, trapped inside their own homes, listening to glass rattle and beams groan as if the buildings themselves were shivering. And the cold, oh, the cold. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was the kind of cold that seared lungs when you breathed too deep, that froze water inside pumps, that cracked iron pipes until water spilled and froze across tenement floors. Fires sputtered in stoves, barely keeping pace. Coal deliveries were impossible because wagons couldn't move through the drifts. Imagine sitting in your apartment, wrapped in every blanket you owned, and still feeling the bite of winter pressing through the walls. That was reality for thousands. The city's heartbeat, its transportation collapsed almost instantly. Elevated trains stalled, their tracks buried or frozen. Streetcars stood abandoned, horses huddled and trembling beside them. The mighty ferries, usually packed with commuters, were locked in place by sheets of ice, their decks coated in frozen spray, ropes stiff as iron. For many, there was no way home, no way to work, no way to reach a hospital or a loved one across town. Telegraph lines snapped under the weight of ice, plunging neighborhoods into silence. No one knew what was happening a few blocks away, let alone in another borough. Imagine the panic of a mother waiting for her child who never made it home from school, or a wife praying her husband, stuck at the docks, hadn't frozen in the night. The city, so proud of its constant connection and energy, was suddenly deaf and blind. And yet, amid the terror, small acts of courage began to surface. Neighbors who had barely exchanged greetings dug tunnels between their doorways. Families pooled their scraps of coal, rationing heat by sitting together in one room. Children carried buckets of snow to melt for water when pipes burst. Sailors lashed boats together so they wouldn't splinter against the frozen piers. Strangers pulled one another from snowdrifts, wrapped them in scarves, and dragged them indoors. It was chaos, yes, but it was also community. And make no mistake, the storm was deadly. Across the Northeast, hundreds perished. Some froze in the streets, overcome by exhaustion before reaching shelter. Others were trapped in stranded trains, their food and fuel running out as the snow piled higher outside. Horses collapsed, carts overturned, and entire neighborhoods sat entombed for days. New York, the city that prided itself on never standing still, was utterly paralyzed. But survival teaches us things. It strips away illusions of control and reminds us of what truly matters. In those white, howling nights, families told stories to their children, not fairy tales, but memories of summers in the park, or the scent of roasted chestnuts at Christmas, anything to keep hope alive. Parents held their kids close and whispered that spring would come, that the snow couldn't last forever. And though it felt endless, they were right. The great blizzard of 1888 was more than just weather. It was a trial by nature. It exposed the cracks in a growing metropolis, how fragile its systems were, how easily progress could be buried. But it also revealed something else: resilience. The stubborn, unyielding refusal of ordinary people to give up, even when the world outside seemed determined to bury them. So when we think of that blizzard today, we don't just see snowdrifts higher than rooftops. We see candlelight flickering in dark tenements. We see neighbors sharing bread and blankets. We see sailors bracing ropes together against the ice, We see children tracing shapes in frosted windows while their parents whispered promises of brighter days. And maybe that's the real story here. Not just that New York froze, but that New Yorkers endured. Life in New York was never equal, and the blizzard made that painfully clear. The storm didn't discriminate. It buried mansions and tenements under the same mountains of snow, but the way people endured it revealed a city divided. Down on the Lower East Side, families crammed into crowded tenement houses, fought simply to stay warm. Coal was scarce even before the storm, and when deliveries stopped, most stoves went cold. Imagine 12 people huddled in a single room, windows stuffed with rags to block the drafts, blankets piled high, children wrapped in shawls and still shivering. Some families melted snow for water, since frozen pipes made wells useless. Mothers tore up old clothes to make rags for insulation. Fathers, desperate, tried to light fires with splintered furniture. In those dim rooms, survival meant creativity. Neighbors pushed food through door cracks, half a loaf of bread, a scoop of beans, because hunger didn't stop just because the streets were frozen. Kids whispered lullabies to younger siblings to quiet their fear, while the walls shook with the howl of the wind. And every candle flame, no matter how small, became a symbol of hope. But uptown, on Fifth Avenue, the story looked different. Wealthy families had mansions stocked with coal, servants tending fires, and pantries filled with imported goods. Their biggest inconvenience was being snowed in, unable to ride their carriages or attend social events. Still, even luxury couldn't silence the storm. Drafts crept under gilded doors. Frost decorated the glass of chandeliers. And for once, the city's elite found themselves isolated, cut off from their theaters, restaurants, and stock exchange. Their wealth built walls, but the blizzard reminded them nature doesn't care about status. Then there were the workers, the lifeblood of the city caught in the storm outside. Carriage drivers abandoned their horses, leading them to any warm stable they could find. Street sweepers, who usually kept order on the avenues, disappeared into the whiteout. Dock workers, stranded by frozen ferries, slept in warehouses, listening to the crack of ice against hulls. And clerks, men like Thomas, who left their offices near Wall Street, found themselves wandering in a nightmare. Streets they had walked 100 times became unrecognizable, twisted into frozen labyrinths. Can you picture it? A man in a wool suit, cane in hand, trudging waist-deep through snow, his scarf frozen stiff against his face, trying to guess which mound of white was the curb and which was an abandoned wagon. Every step a gamble, every block an ordeal, and yet, step by step, they pressed on. The harbor told its own story. Ferries that once carried thousands sat immobilized, their decks coated in ice, ropes frozen to the piers. Sailors braced ships together, shouting instructions over the storm, their voices nearly swallowed by the wind. Young apprentices, frightened by the cracks and groans of frozen rigging, were steadied by old captains who whispered, "Lean with it, son. Don't fight the storm, bend with it." It was a brutal lesson, but one that saved lives. And through it all, the city's heartbeat slowed, but never stopped. Bakers, like Mr. Whitman, worked through the night, kneading dough by lantern light, sliding loaves into ovens, and handing out bread to shivering neighbors. Every golden crust wasn't just food, it was hope you could taste. Laborers dug narrow paths between buildings, their shovels clanging against frozen cobblestones. carving tiny lifelines through the drifts. Strangers locked arms to help one another across icy intersections, turning survival into a shared act of courage. Rich or poor, immigrant or native-born, sailor or banker, everyone learned the same truth. The blizzard was bigger than them all. It was humbling, terrifying, and uniting in its own strange way. Because in those days, survival wasn't measured in money or status. It was measured in warmth, shared, bread divided, hands extended. And though the city was buried, its people ordinary, extraordinary people refused to be. By the second day, New York City looked nothing like itself. The proud avenues, normally alive with the clip-clop of horses and the rumble of streetcars, had vanished under mountains of snow. Entire blocks disappeared. Street signs and lampposts peeked out like relics half buried in a glacier. It wasn't just a storm anymore. It was a complete transformation of the city into an alien landscape. Streetcars sat frozen in place, their iron wheels trapped beneath drifts that rose higher than their windows. Horses, once the engines of the city, stood shivering, their manes crusted with ice, eyes wide and panicked, as wind whipped snow into their faces. Some were led away to barns. Others were simply abandoned where they stood, left as ghostly silhouettes in the whiteout. Overhead, the city's new invention, electric wires, snapped and tangled under the storm's fury. Telegraph lines whipped like angry serpents in the wind before crashing to the ground, spitting sparks into the snow. Poles cracked, crashing across streets and sidewalks. In some neighborhoods, entire webs of wire lay snarled in the drifts, forcing pedestrians to crawl under or detour around hazards hidden in the white chaos. And speaking of pedestrians, those who dared to venture outside looked less like commuters and more like survivors in some frozen wilderness. Wrapped in every layer they owned, they leaned into the wind as though fighting a physical hand pushing them back. Their faces, red and raw from the cold, were barely visible between scarves stiff with frost. From a distance, they looked like moving shadows, figures swallowed by the snow, appearing and vanishing like ghosts. Imagine stepping out of your tenement or boarding house and finding the street gone. Instead of cobblestones, there were canyons of snow, ridges and valleys that twisted the city into something unrecognizable. Even familiar landmarks seemed uncanny. Broadway was buried so deeply that carriages looked like toys dropped in a sandbox. The Bowery was silent, its usual noise replaced by the howl of the wind. And then there was the silence, an eerie, unsettling quiet, broken only by the groan of wood, the snap of ice, or the occasional cry for help from someone stranded in a drift. New York, a city famous for never sleeping, had been muffled, smothered, wrapped in a thick blanket of white. Some tried to dig themselves out. Men with shovels hacked at the snow, trying to clear paths to doors or stairwells. But for every inch they gained, the storm seemed to add 2 more. Others gave up, retreating indoors to wait for any sign that the storm might ease. Yet the snow kept falling, hour after relentless hour. For travelers stranded in the city, it was chaos. Trains couldn't run. Ferries were frozen in the harbor. No stagecoaches, no deliveries, no post. New York had become an island unto itself, cut off from the outside world, trapped in its own storm-forged prison. But perhaps the most haunting image was the sight of people caught mid-journey when the blizzard struck. Clerks leaving offices, mothers walking children home, laborers heading back from shifts. They were swallowed by the storm in minutes. Some stumbled into strangers' homes for shelter. Others vanished into the white and never came back. The city wasn't just frozen, it was paralyzed. The great blizzard of 1888 didn't just cover New York in snow, it stopped it in its tracks. And for those trudging through those streets, survival meant one thing: keep moving, one step at a time, no matter how deep the drifts or how fierce the wind. As the blizzard pressed into its second and third day, the storm revealed its cruelest side. New York wasn't just buried, it was suffering. And for many, the storm became a deadly trap. By Tuesday morning, bodies were already being reported across the city. Some were found slumped against snowbanks, their outlines half hidden beneath white drifts. They had set out on errands, convinced they could make a short trip to a neighbor's house or the corner store, only to collapse in the storm's grip. Others were discovered in alleys and stairwells, where they had sought brief shelter from the wind, but the cold was too merciless. One of the most tragic scenes came from the city's streetcars. Many had frozen in place during the height of the storm, passengers trapped inside. At first, people stayed put, hoping the winds would ease. But as hours turned into a full day, the cold inside became more unbearable than the blizzard outside. Windows iced over, the air turned frigid, and families had to decide: brave the whiteout or remain in a coffin of frost. Some staggered out and found shelter, others never made it home. The East River, normally alive with ferries, became a death trap. When ice clogged the waters, dozens of ferries froze mid-journey. Crews and passengers tried to wait it out, huddling together in cabins, breath fogging the air, until they were finally rescued, or until exhaustion claimed them. The storm blurred the line between land and water, and some who attempted to cross were swallowed by the icy currents beneath broken sheets of ice. Even police and rescue workers weren't spared. Officers who tried to patrol were often forced to turn back, blinded by snow that stung like glass. Horses pulling wagons collapsed mid-street, their bodies stiffening in the drifts, too exhausted to rise again. Doctors making house calls became stranded, carrying medicine but unable to reach patients in time. The newspapers of the time painted a chilling picture: nearly 400 deaths across the city and surrounding areas. Some froze in their own homes when stoves failed or coal ran out. Others perished on rooftops, trying to clear chimneys, slipping and vanishing into the snow below. There were even reports of sailors lost at sea, their ships caught in the storm's monstrous reach far beyond the harbor. Think about it. One storm, just 4 days long, claimed more lives in New York than most fires, floods, or accidents of that era. It was nature reminding the most modern city in America that progress couldn't outpace the raw force of wind and ice. And yet, even amid this tragedy, stories of human resilience emerged. Families took in stranded strangers. Neighbors dug paths to free the elderly trapped in their homes. Volunteers carried hot food through knee-deep drifts to those who had none. The storm exposed fragility, but it also revealed solidarity. Still, there was no denying it. The great blizzard of 1888 was a disaster of staggering proportions. By the time the winds finally began to ease, New York was a city half buried, grieving its dead and facing the enormous task of digging itself back to life. When the storm finally began to ease, New York didn't look like New York anymore. It looked like an Arctic ruin. Streets weren't streets. They were tunnels carved between walls of snow. Entire buildings were buried up to their second floors, and doorways had to be dug open with shovels just to let families breathe fresh air again. The city government scrambled into action. But how do you clear snow when every block is packed higher than a man's shoulders? The answer at first was simple: manpower. Thousands of workers, many of them desperate for pay, were hired to dig. Armed with shovels and picks, they carved trenches through Broadway, Bowery, and the side streets. Each scoop of snow revealed another layer of frozen chaos: abandoned carts, toppled lampposts, and even the bodies of horses frozen mid-stride. It was exhausting work. Men worked in shifts, their breath rising like steam, while crowds gathered just to cheer when a path was finally opened to a bakery or a butcher. For families trapped in tenements with dwindling supplies, those first cleared passages meant survival. The fire department had its own nightmare. Hydrants were buried under 6 feet of snow, and when fires broke out, crews had to waste precious minutes just digging to find the water. Some buildings burned unchecked simply because fire engines couldn't reach them. Imagine standing at your window, watching flames consume a neighbor's building, knowing that the snow made rescue impossible. Then came the railroads. Train service had been paralyzed, tracks swallowed under mountains of snow. Entire locomotives were stranded, their engines useless against the white wall blocking their way. It took weeks, yes, weeks, for rail lines to resume anything close to normal service. Crews had to dig out tracks inch by inch, and, in some cases, dynamite was used to break apart the densest drifts. On the harbor, men with axes hacked at the ice, trying to free ferries that had been frozen in place. They worked side by side with sailors, cutting channels wide enough to pull vessels back to shore. The smell of salt water finally mixing with air again was, for many, the first true sign that the city was waking up. Even ordinary citizens pitched in. Neighbors formed bucket brigades, not for water, but for snow. They dug out stoops, cleared paths to bakeries, and helped uncover the bodies of animals that needed to be removed before disease spread. Children joined too, turning snow removal into play, cheering when they unearthed a street lamp or carved tunnels through towering drifts. And through all this, there was a humbling realization. New York's proud infrastructure had failed. The telegraph lines, torn down by the weight of ice, elevated trains, shut down, streetcars, frozen. The blizzard had exposed just how fragile the city really was, and it forced leaders to think about how to build a city that could withstand the next storm. But for now, survival was enough. Every shovel of snow cleared was a victory. Every reopened street was a lifeline. The digging out wasn't just about freeing New York from the blizzard's grip. It was about proving that even after the most brutal storm in memory, the city could rise again, one path, one street, and one neighborhood at a time. When the last shovels had cleared the streets and the harbor thawed enough for ferries to move again, New York stood at a crossroads. The blizzard hadn't just been a natural disaster. It was a revelation, a warning carved in snow and ice. For days, the greatest city in America had been brought to its knees. And it wasn't just the snow that had done it. It was the fragile systems New Yorkers had relied on. Telegraph poles had snapped like toothpicks, leaving businesses and newspapers cut off from the rest of the prize. Country. Streetcars sat frozen, unable to move without their rails. Elevated trains, hailed as marvels of engineering, stood useless against the storm's fury. People began to ask uncomfortable questions. How could a modern city call itself modern if a few days of snow could silence it completely? How could a place that prided itself on progress and innovation still rely on wooden poles and tangled wires that collapsed at the first sign of weight? The answers came slowly, but they came. City leaders, pushed by the outrage and desperation of citizens, began to make decisions that would reshape New York for the century to come. The first, bury the wires. The blizzard had turned overhead lines into deadly whips of ice and metal, crashing into streets and buildings. Within years, crews began digging trenches to place telegraph and electrical cables underground, safer from wind, snow, and ice. The second, rethink transportation. If the elevated trains could freeze, maybe the solution was to go deeper, below the storm, into the earth. The dream of a subway, long talked about, suddenly felt less like fantasy and more like necessity. The blizzard hadn't just buried streets. It had dug the first outlines of a plan for underground trains. By the early 1900s, that vision would become reality. And perhaps most important, the storm forced New Yorkers to confront the human cost of poor planning. Thousands had been stranded in tenements without heat or food. Workers had died in drifts trying to reach jobs that no longer existed. Families had starved in rooms where bread turned hard and water froze in basins. Charities, churches, and neighbors had done their best, but the city itself had no safety net. The Great Blizzard of 1888 made it clear. New York needed better systems, not just for its buildings, but for its people. Looking back, it's striking. Out of ice and tragedy came progress. Out of silence and paralysis came determination. The blizzard revealed every weakness, but it also sparked ideas that would carry New York into the future. Without that storm, perhaps the city's wires would have stayed tangled in the air for decades more. Perhaps the subway would have remained a distant dream. Instead, the storm forced a choice: adapt or be buried again. And New York, as it always had, chose to rise. Every great storm leaves behind numbers. How many inches of snow? How many dollars in damages? How many lives lost? But what really lingers, what really defines a tragedy, are the stories. And the blizzard of 1888 was filled with them, some heartbreaking, some inspiring, all unforgettable. Take the story of young Katie Weeks, a Brooklyn schoolgirl. When the storm struck, she was walking home with her younger brother. The snow fell so fast it blinded them, swallowing familiar streets. Katie held her brother's hand, guiding him through drifts that reached their chests. Hours later, they stumbled into a stranger's doorway, frostbitten but alive. That simple act of courage, one child refusing to let go of another, became a small miracle remembered by neighbors for years. Not everyone was so fortunate. In Manhattan, a clerk named James Donnelly tried to make it home from his office near Wall Street. He left too late, underestimating the storm's strength. By morning, he was found frozen, just blocks from his boarding house. His pockets carried a letter he'd never sent, an apology to his mother for missing a family visit. His story spread in newspapers, a sobering reminder of how close safety could be yet how unreachable in the storm's grip. Then there were the sailors. The harbor was a scene of chaos as ice locked ships in place and furious waves battered the shoreline. A Norwegian vessel, the Hans Boye, was driven onto rocks off Staten Island. Sailors clung to the rigging as waves crashed over them. Locals, risking their own lives, formed human chains through the icy surf to pull the men ashore. Not all survived, but those who did owed their lives to strangers who refused to stand by. And in tenement neighborhoods, where heat and food were scarce, survival depended on kindness. Neighbors shared scraps of coal, pooled bread, and boiled snow for water. One widow, Mrs. Levine, was remembered for opening her single-room apartment to 3 children whose parents had been lost in the storm. "We will all huddle together," she reportedly said, "and maybe that will be enough." For those children, it was. Amid the tragedies were also tales of resilience that bordered on legend. In New Haven, a mail carrier trudged his route despite the storm, delivering letters strapped across his chest. "The storm may delay me," he told one resident, "but it won't stop me." In a time when connection was as fragile as a telegraph wire, that determination meant more than words on paper. These stories remind us that the blizzard wasn't just about snow and cold, it was about people. Ordinary men and women caught in extraordinary circumstances. Some froze, some endured, some became heroes in ways they never expected. Even today, their names are carved into history not because they were powerful, but because in the darkest hours of the storm, they revealed the most human truths: love, sacrifice, courage, and sometimes heartbreaking loss. When the storm finally loosened its grip, and the snow began to settle into hardened banks along every street, newspapers rushed to tell the story. And in 1888, the newspaper was king. Headlines screamed across the front pages in bold type, "The city paralyzed, hundreds dead in the snow, a storm for the ages." Every detail was written with the kind of urgency that only a city still shaking from disaster could produce. Reporters spoke of men frozen in doorways, of families starving in tenements, of ships wrecked just beyond the harbor. They described snowbanks higher than streetcars, and winds that howled like a living thing. One paper called it the storm that humbled New York. Another dubbed it the White Hurricane. But the newspapers didn't just report. They shaped the way the storm was remembered. Stories of bravery filled the columns. Postmen trudging through drifts. Neighbors rescuing one another. Doctors crossing miles of frozen streets to reach patients. The tragedy was real, but the press found moments of triumph in the suffering. In a time before radio or television, these written accounts carried the voices of survivors across the entire nation. Illustrators worked overtime, sketching scenes of snow-choked avenues, toppled telegraph poles, and sailors clinging to icy rigging. These images, reproduced in papers from New York to San Francisco, transformed local suffering into a national drama. Readers who had never seen a New York street felt the weight of the snow, the bite of the wind, the fear of being trapped. There was also anger, and the papers did not hold back. Editorials demanded to know why the city had been caught so unprepared. Why weren't the telegraph lines buried underground, where storms couldn't reach them? Why wasn't there a better system for street cleaning or emergency response? Why had so many lives been lost when the danger had been visible for hours? And in these questions lay the seeds of change. Because the blizzard wasn't just a natural disaster, it became a public reckoning. Politicians felt the pressure. Ordinary citizens demanded reforms. The press, relentless in its coverage, made sure the storm could not be brushed aside as just another winter. If you flip through those old yellowed pages today, the words almost leap off the page. You can feel the raw shock, the grief, and the awe. The Great Blizzard of 1888 wasn't just an event, it was a story told in ink, in sketches, in bold headlines that made sure no one would forget how a modern city could be brought to its knees by nature in a single night. In the weeks that followed the blizzard, the city didn't just shovel snow, it began to rethink itself. Disasters have a way of exposing weaknesses, and the Great Blizzard of 1888 exposed plenty. Telegraph and telephone poles had snapped like matchsticks, leaving New Yorkers isolated from the rest of the country. Elevated trains froze solid on their tracks, stranding passengers in the air. Horses and wagons struggled to move even after the storm ended, choked by icy streets. The newspapers had been relentless in pointing out these failures, and the public was furious. Something had to change. And change it did. First came the wires. The storm had ripped down hundreds of miles of telegraph and telephone lines, leaving the city in silence. People remembered what it felt like to be cut off, to wonder what was happening just a few blocks away, with no way to find out. Within months, the call went out. Put the wires underground. It was not easy. It meant tearing up streets, laying conduits, and investing millions. But the blizzard had made the alternative unthinkable. By the early 1890s, one of the lasting legacies of the storm was clear skies above the city, free of the spider web of wires that had once hung there. Next came transportation. During the blizzard, elevated trains had frozen, streetcars had vanished, and the city had come to a standstill. That memory lingered. It gave new momentum to an idea that had been floated for decades, but resisted as too costly, too complex. A subway. If trains could run underground, safe from snow and wind, the city would never again be so paralyzed. It took more than a decade of planning, but in 1904, New York opened its first subway line, an idea that might never have moved forward so boldly without the memory of 1888's frozen paralysis. The blizzard also pushed reforms in emergency planning. City officials realized that they needed better systems for communication, for distributing food, and for clearing snow. Hospitals began developing stronger networks for emergencies. Fire departments and police refined their coordination. Even the Department of Sanitation found itself reshaped in the decades that followed, charged with keeping the city's arteries open no matter the weather. Ordinary people, too, carried lessons forward. Families began keeping more food at home, more coal for heat, and a sharper awareness that even in the world's largest city, nature could turn daily life upside down in a single night. So while the blizzard left destruction, it also left a blueprint for progress. Out of the drifts and frozen silence, New York began to build itself into the modern city we know today. A city of subways, underground wires, and emergency systems designed to withstand storms that once would have brought it to its knees. The Great Blizzard of 1888 had humbled New York, but it also forced the city to grow stronger. In that way, The storm was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. When the snow finally loosened its grip, New Yorkers did not return to life with a sudden rush. Instead, the city eased back into its rhythm, slow and cautious, like someone waking from a long fever. Streets were still narrow channels of ice, sidewalks lined with towering drifts. But behind every door, life was quietly reassembling itself. Families who had spent days huddled in darkened apartments began to bring out their routines again. Mothers boiled water for tea, the steam rising with a comforting hiss. Children tugged at scarves, eager to run outside and test the softened snow. Fathers cleared paths with whatever tools they had left: shovels, pans, even broken planks of wood, turning survival back into daily habit. There was relief in simple sounds: the clink of spoons in mugs, the creak of floorboards under steady footsteps, the muffled laughter of neighbors sharing stories across hallways. People remembered what it felt like to sit at a table, share bread, and feel warmth that was not just from coal, but from company. On the rooftops, men like Samuel and Clara kept up their quiet watch, not because danger still lingered, but because it had become a ritual. From above, they could see children building snowmen in courtyards, their laughter floating upward, thin but persistent. They could see neighbors leaning on shovels, exchanging tired smiles, and hear the low, steady hum of the city finding its footing again. The harbor, too, reflected this shift. Boats that had been locked in ice for days now rocked gently in the thawing water. Sailors mended ropes, checked nets, and spoke in voices more relaxed than before. Every creak of wood, every soft splash of water against the docks, carried the sound of life resuming. What struck many people was how precious the smallest things felt. A fresh loaf of bread smelled like a feast. A lantern glowing at night felt like a promise. A simple conversation on the street carried more weight than before. Survival had made people attentive to details they had once ignored. Evenings became sanctuaries. Lamps cast soft golden light across snow-dusted streets. Families gathered close, children wrapped in blankets, parents reading aloud or humming lullabies. Outside, the city was hushed, but inside, kitchens and parlors hummed with warmth, gratitude, and a sense of belonging that no storm could erase. The blizzard had changed routines, but it had also deepened them. Life was no longer taken for granted. It was savored, piece by piece, meal by meal, moment by moment. And in that deliberate pace, New Yorkers discovered a quiet kind of joy, the kind born not from ease, but from endurance. What people remembered most about the days after the blizzard wasn't only the cold or the hunger, it was the kindness. In every borough, in tenement stairwells and along the narrow shoveled paths, neighbors who once passed each other with only a nod began to stop and talk. One woman might bring an extra loaf of bread to the family across the hall. Another would help carry water up 4 flights of stairs to an elderly widow. Children swapped scarves and mittens, and when one child lost a boot in a snowbank, 3 others helped dig until they found it. These weren't grand gestures. They were small, steady acts of care, but they were the glue that held the city together. Even in wealthier neighborhoods, the divide between rich and poor blurred for a moment. Merchants who had managed to protect their supplies opened doors to share food. Families with coal gave some to those who had none. And in places like the Lower East Side, where poverty had always been a constant companion. Strangers treated one another like kin, bound by the shared ordeal of the storm. Rooftop watchers like Samuel and Clara noticed this shift from above. Where they once saw isolated figures trudging through the drifts, they now saw people moving in pairs or small groups, helping each other steady on the icy paths. Where silence had once hung over the city, now came the gentle sound of laughter, cautious but real. In the harbor, sailors exchanged more than tools. They shared stories of how they endured, how one man had lit his lantern every night for passing travelers, or how another had given his last bit of food to a stranded boy. These stories spread quickly, carried from dock to tavern, from street corner to kitchen table, becoming part of the city's memory of survival. Evenings glowed with this renewed spirit. Neighbors gathered in hallways, not just to stay warm, but to talk. They shared tea, soup, and tales of courage. They remembered the baker who opened his oven to heat frozen hands, the constable who risked his life to guide travelers, the mother who sang lullabies so her children would not notice their empty stomachs. What the storm revealed was that resilience was not only about grit, it was about connection. New York had been tested not just by nature's wrath, but by the measure of its people. And in those quiet days of recovery, as snow melted into shining rivulets along the cobblestones, the city discovered that endurance was strongest when it was shared. The great blizzard of 1888 had taken lives, yes, but it had also given something back. A reminder that survival is never solitary. It is carried in the hands that lift, the words that comfort, and the bonds forged in snow. As the days turned into weeks, the snowbanks that once towered above people's heads slowly melted, revealing not just cobblestones and sidewalks, but hard truths about the city itself. The great blizzard of 1888 wasn't just a storm, it was a mirror. It showed New York what it was made of and what it still lacked. One of the first realizations was painfully clear. The city's infrastructure wasn't built for disaster. Telegraph and telephone wires had snapped like twigs under the ice, leaving entire neighborhoods cut off. Families in Brooklyn had no way to reach loved ones in Manhattan. Businesses lost track of their supplies, and even emergency orders from city officials couldn't travel faster than a man trudging through the snow. New Yorkers began to ask questions. Why were power lines still strung high above streets, where storms could rip them down? Why had the railroads, those proud iron veins of the city, left passengers stranded in frozen cars without food or heat? Why did water pumps freeze, leaving entire blocks dry, while wealthier families found ways to keep theirs running? The storm sparked debates in taverns, churches, and town halls. Some argued that the city needed stronger leadership. Others believed the answer lay in better planning and technology. What everyone agreed on, however, was that change was necessary. This blizzard would become the catalyst for one of New York's most important transformations, moving its electrical and communication lines underground. No longer would the lifelines of a city hang vulnerable to the sky. It was a lesson learned in frost and hardship, but one that shaped the modern skyline we know today. Transportation, too, was forever altered. After the storm brought elevated trains to a standstill, the push for a subway system gained urgency. If the city was to survive future winters, or any disaster at all, it needed a network that could endure below the snow and wind. The dream of an underground railway, once dismissed as impractical, now seemed essential. But the storm's lessons weren't just about wires and rails. They were about people. The rich discovered that their carriages couldn't save them when the streets vanished beneath mountains of snow. The poor discovered that even with nothing, they could share enough to survive. And the city as a whole discovered that survival wasn't about strength alone. It was about foresight, about building systems that cared for all, not just the privileged. Samuel and Clara, looking down from their rooftop as the city slowly healed, understood this better than most. They saw officials marking damaged poles for removal. They saw workers mapping new routes for underground cables. And they saw neighbors talking with a seriousness that hinted at something bigger, that the storm was not just an ending, but a beginning. The Great Blizzard of 1888 didn't just freeze New York. It forced it to thaw, to rethink, to prepare for a future where nature's fury would not catch it so vulnerable again. And in that quiet realization, as sunlight finally warmed the last stubborn patches of snow, New York took its first steps toward becoming the modern city of resilience we know today. When the storm finally released its grip, the city did not return to normal overnight. Daily life had to be rebuilt, piece by piece, with the kind of patience only hardship can teach. Shops opened slowly. Bakers swept ice from their steps before lighting their ovens, and the smell of bread drifted once again through narrow streets. Tailors stitched torn coats, their fingers raw from days spent in unheated rooms. But even as commerce flickered back, nothing felt routine. Every transaction carried a reminder of the storm flour was scarce, candles in short supply, and prices had climbed as merchants tried to recover their losses. Schools too struggled. Many buildings had been buried under drifts so high that doors couldn't be opened for weeks. Teachers, when classes finally resumed, noticed children quieter, thinner, and more reflective. Lessons paused often as little ones asked about the storm, recounting the nights they had huddled in darkness while the wind screamed outside. Education was not only about books. Now it was about giving children a sense of safety again. For workers, the return was uneven. Dock laborers faced treacherous ice on the waterfront, moving crates with a caution that slowed everything to a crawl. Carriage drivers resumed their routes, but horses slipped constantly on the thawing cobblestones. Factory owners reopened plants, but absenteeism lingered. Many families were still digging out, still patching roofs, still repairing stoves shattered by frost. Even entertainment bore the storm's mark. Theaters, when they reopened, drew crowds desperate for escape. But plays were often interrupted by jokes about snowbanks and trains stuck in the drifts, reminders that laughter was itself a form of survival. In taverns, men told exaggerated tales of how they had battled the storm, each story becoming part of a shared folklore. At home, life carried a new rhythm. Families who once shut their doors tight now leaned on neighbors more than ever. Borrowed firewood, shared meals, and simple gestures of kindness had made survival possible, and no one forgot it. Even weeks later, neighbors still lingered in doorways, still swapped stories, still carried with them the unspoken bond of having endured something historic together. And in the quiet moments when a mother stirred stew, or a father helped his child into bed, there was a tenderness born from the awareness that survival had not been guaranteed. The storm had stripped life down to its essentials: warmth, food, shelter, and human connection. And though the snow melted, that truth remained. The great blizzard of 1888 left scars on buildings, on streets, and on hearts. But it also left a deepened sense of resilience. New Yorkers discovered that even in the darkest, coldest days, life could be rebuilt, stronger and wiser than before. Long after the snow had melted, the blizzard lived on in memory. People could not stop talking about where they had been, what they had seen, or how close they had come to losing everything. In a way, the city carried two timelines: the life before the storm and the life after it. Grandparents told stories to children about how the wind screamed like a living creature, rattling doors and tearing shingles from rooftops. Men who had braved the streets spoke of walls of snow taller than carriages, and women recalled the terror of running out of coal while the thermometer plunged lower each night. Every household had a version of the story, and each was passed down like a piece of family history. In the newspapers, reporters continued to revisit the blizzard for weeks, printing letters from readers who shared their experiences. Some accounts were heartbreaking. Families stranded without food, or loved ones who never came home. Others carried a lighter tone, stories of neighbors laughing while digging tunnels through the snow, or children turning the frozen city into the grandest playground they had ever seen. Memories shaped neighborhoods. A street corner where people had been trapped together became a place of connection. A bakery that handed out free loaves of bread was remembered with gratitude for years. Even the names of ordinary men and women appeared in local lore: people who had shown courage, not by grand heroics, but by staying steady, by helping, by refusing to give in to fear. The storm also left physical reminders that carried memory forward. Some houses bore scars from collapsed roofs or broken chimneys. Certain streets, once impassable, became symbols of survival when traffic resumed. Bridges that had shuddered under the weight of snow were spoken of with awe, as if they had stood guard over the city. But perhaps the strongest memory was emotional: the way the storm had stripped life to its essentials, revealing what mattered most. People remembered the kindness of a stranger more vividly than the bitter cold. They recalled the warmth of shared soup more clearly than the hunger that preceded it. They remembered laughter in the middle of fear, and the way the city, so often bustling and impersonal, had suddenly felt like a single neighborhood. Years later, when winter winds howled through the streets again, parents would glance at their children and whisper, "You don't know cold until you've seen 88." And the children would listen, wide-eyed, realizing that the great blizzard was more than weather. It was a story, a legacy, a reminder that New York City had once been brought to its knees and had risen again. Out of the misery of March 1888 came lessons that would change New York forever. The storm had not just buried streets, it had exposed the city's weaknesses for all to see. Telegraph wires snapped like twigs. Elevated train lines froze in place. Their cars stranded mid-track. Delivery wagons vanished under drifts, and with them, the lifelines of food and fuel. For weeks, officials debated what had gone wrong. The blizzard had proven that a modern metropolis could not depend entirely on fragile above-ground systems. Sooner or later, another storm would come, and without change, the same chaos would repeat. That realization pushed leaders to think underground. It was after this disaster that momentum for burying power and telegraph lines finally gained strength. Those twisted poles that had toppled into the streets were no longer seen as progress, they were liabilities. Crews began the long work of placing wires below the surface, hidden where storms could not reach them. The blizzard also planted the seeds for New York's most famous innovation, the subway. People remembered how the elevated trains froze, their iron rails locked in ice. If the city could not move above ground, it would have to move below. Decades of planning and resistance melted after '88, because the storm had proven beyond argument that New York needed a system immune to blizzards. When the first subway line finally opened in 1904, many credited the Great Blizzard for lighting the spark. But change did not stop there. City agencies began stockpiling emergency coal and supplies, readying themselves for shortages. Volunteer groups that had formed spontaneously during the storm inspired more formal disaster relief networks. Hospitals, too, updated their practices, having seen how easily patients could be cut off from aid. Ordinary citizens adjusted as well. Families kept small reserves of food and fuel through each winter, just in case. Shopkeepers learned to prepare for interruptions in delivery, keeping their shelves stocked a little higher. Even children were taught what to do if another storm of that scale ever returned. In that sense, the blizzard became a teacher. It had taken lives, toppled businesses, and silenced the city for days. But it also forced everyone to rethink what resilience meant. New York's survival was no longer about pushing through each storm. It was about building a city that could endure whatever nature hurled at it. Every cobblestone, every buried wire, every underground tunnel carried a memory of '88. The storm had reshaped not only streets and skylines, but also the way New Yorkers thought about the future. Out of white silence came determination. Out of hardship came progress. Long after the snow melted, the Great Blizzard of 1888 lingered in memory like a scar across New York's history. Newspapers of the time filled pages with harrowing stories. Headlines screamed of men frozen in drifts, families trapped in tenements, and rescue efforts that played out like wartime dispatches. Some journalists wrote with raw urgency, others with poetic awe at the storm's sheer force. Illustrations captured the drama vividly. Woodcuts showed horse-drawn wagons swallowed by white walls of snow, children bundled in rags, and policemen nearly invisible in blinding drifts. For readers in far-off states, the images gave the blizzard a mythical weight, turning it into one of the most famous weather disasters of the century. Writers, too, found inspiration. In the years that followed, poems and short stories spoke of the white silence and the city buried beneath the sky's wrath. Some wrote of loss, others of resilience, but all agreed that the storm had changed the way people saw New York, less invincible, more human. Families passed down stories like heirlooms. Grandparents would tell children how the snow reached second-story windows, how they cooked bread from scraps or huddled by stoves burning anything they could find. For the young, these tales became part of their family's identity, proof that their kin had endured one of the harshest trials the city had ever known. There was also a sense of pride. Surviving the blizzard meant you had been tested. Some people joked that you weren't truly a New Yorker until you had lived through March of '88. That pride made its way into speeches, into neighborhood lore, and even into politics, where leaders invoked the storm as a lesson in unity and preparedness. Even decades later, when subways hummed beneath the city and electric lights shone steady regardless of the weather, People still spoke of the Great White Hurricane, as it was sometimes called. It had become more than a storm. It was a benchmark, a measuring stick for every winter that came after. Whenever snow began to fall heavily in the years that followed, someone would always say, "It's nothing compared to '88." And in that phrase, you can hear it. The memory of a city humbled but unbroken, frozen but never defeated. Behind the statistics, behind the headlines of paralysis and death, were people real lives forever marked by the storm. New York's history books might talk about numbers, but its memory rests in the stories of individuals who endured those frozen days. One tale often retold was that of the telegraph operators. Cut off from one another as lines snapped and poles collapsed, some operators chose to stay in their drafty offices, pounding keys into the night, even when they knew no signal would escape the storm. They kept at it out of duty and hope, tapping messages into the void until their fingers stiffened. To them, silence was unbearable. One operator later said he felt like the city itself had gone mute. His words were remembered long after the snow was gone. Then there were the street cleaners and laborers, men who had no choice but to shovel, even as the wind cut at their faces like knives. Many collapsed in exhaustion, yet their work carved the first fragile paths that allowed food and coal to move again. Their names never made it into the papers, but without them, neighborhoods might have starved in silence. In some homes, unexpected heroes emerged. A young girl on the Lower East Side reportedly saved her baby brother by keeping him wrapped against her own chest all through the night, refusing to sleep, whispering lullabies while her mother worked to keep a failing stove alive. Years later, her family swore that her stubborn devotion had been the difference between life and death. There were tragedies too, reminders of how merciless the storm could be. Elderly men lost in drifts only a few feet from their front doors. Children who wandered outside chasing after parents and never returned. Entire families waiting for help that never arrived. These stories carried a weight that haunted survivors for decades. But alongside the sorrow were tales of courage that became part of New York's folklore. Sailors who tied themselves together with ropes so that if one fell into the frozen harbor, the others could pull him out. Neighbors who tore down wooden fences to fuel the stoves of families they barely knew. Strangers who carried the weak through chest-high drifts, step by brutal step. The blizzard turned ordinary citizens into quiet legends. Not heroes in the dramatic, triumphant sense, but in the small, essential ways that matter most, through warmth shared, burdens carried, and hands extended in darkness. And perhaps that is why the storm left such an imprint. It wasn't just about the snow or the cold. It was about the faces remembered, the voices heard through the walls, the neighbors whose names were never forgotten. It was about a city discovering in the worst of nights how much light still burned within it. When the snow finally melted and the city staggered back into motion, New York faced a sobering realization. This wasn't just a freak storm to be forgotten. It was a warning carved into the ice, a reminder that a city of millions could be brought to its knees overnight. And New Yorkers, stubborn and practical, decided they would never be caught so unprepared again. One of the biggest changes was transportation. For decades, the city had relied on elevated trains, clattering above the streets on iron tracks. But during the blizzard, those lines froze solid. Trains were stranded mid-journey. passengers trapped for hours in howling winds. The public's faith in the L cracked as badly as the rails themselves. Out of that failure came a radical new idea: move the trains underground, safe from snow and wind. The blizzard of 1888 didn't just freeze New York, it planted the seed of the subway system that would transform the city in the years ahead. Communications also had to change. The storm had ripped down miles of telegraph and telephone wires, leaving the city isolated at the very moment it most needed connection. Businesses and politicians agreed. The jungle of overhead wires was too fragile. Soon after, utility companies began burying their lines beneath the streets, hiding them away from the fury of winter. The skyline grew cleaner, and the city grew stronger. Even simple things were rethought. Fire departments demanded better equipment after too many engines froze solid. Hospitals argued for more stockpiled supplies so they would not run out of medicine or blankets in the next emergency. Schools and workplaces developed closure policies, realizing that no job or lesson was worth a life lost in the snow. But perhaps the deepest change was cultural. New Yorkers carried the blizzard in their memory for generations. Families told stories of those endless nights by the fire, of trudging through white streets where even Broadway vanished. Those memories bred a kind of pride, harsh but enduring. People would say, "My grandfather lived through '88, as if it were a badge of honor, proof of resilience in the face of nature's fury. The blizzard humbled New York, but it also reshaped it. Out of snowdrifts came innovation. Out of silence came determination. Out of suffering came a vision for a city that could stand taller, dig deeper, and endure longer. And maybe that's the greatest legacy of those frozen days. The reminder that hardship doesn't just scar, it teaches, it changes, and sometimes it builds a stronger tomorrow. As days stretched further from that brutal march, the city found itself walking a fine line between exhaustion and renewal. Snow still clung stubbornly to rooftops and alley corners, but it was softer now, streaked with gray where the sun had finally kissed it. Horses clopped cautiously along half-cleared streets, their breaths puffing into the cool air, while workers shoveled with a rhythm that felt less like desperation and more like steady recovery. Families in tenements opened windows just a crack, letting in the fresh air that carried the smell of melting ice and damp earth. Children pressed their noses to glass, marveling at tiny streams carving paths through the gutters like silver ribbons. What had once been a city buried and gasping for breath now exhaled slowly, rediscovering its pulse. But the blizzard's shadow lingered. Markets opened later than usual, their shelves thinned from days without deliveries. Street vendors carried their wares carefully, setting up stalls in pockets of cleared space, their voices quieter, more measured. People who passed stopped not just to buy but to talk, to ask how families had fared, to swap stories of survival. In those conversations, laughter was soft but genuine, as if every chuckle was proof that life was winning again. Up on the rooftops, Samuel and Clara still kept watch, though their role had shifted. No longer guarding against tearing winds or collapsing chimneys, they now looked down at a city carefully piecing itself together. Smoke from chimneys curled gently instead of frantically. Lanterns glowed not as lifelines, but as signals of return. For the first time in days, they allowed themselves to breathe deeply, to feel the warmth of sunlight on their cheeks instead of the bite of frozen air. The harbor echoed the same transition. Ice still floated in jagged sheets, but boats creaked with a sense of purpose as sailors tugged ropes, checked cargo, and tested the waters. It wasn't normal, yet not even close, but it was progress. And in progress, there was hope. Evenings carried a new kind of hush, not the suffocating silence of the storm, but the calm of people settling back into rhythm. Kitchens smelled of stew, bread, and coffee. Neighbors lingered longer in doorways, sharing quiet gratitude before retreating inside. Each gesture offering a loaf, helping clear a stoop, guiding children across a slick patch, was another stitch in the city's healing fabric. The great blizzard of 1888 had cracked New York wide open, but as part of its people's nature, those cracks were already being filled with kindness, patience, and a shared determination. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the promise of one. By the 20th day after the storm, New York looked nothing like it had before. The streets were no longer seas of white, yet the scars of the blizzard still marked every corner. Wooden awnings bowed under the weight they had carried, fences splintered from falling drifts, and church bells that once rang proudly had gone silent from frozen tongues. But beneath the damage was a new rhythm, one that pulsed with gratitude, resilience, and quiet reflection. Shopkeepers opened their doors slowly, sweeping away the last of the ice from stoops and displaying what little goods they had managed to salvage. Customers didn't rush. Instead, they lingered, exchanging gentle words, sharing where they had been trapped, or how long it had been since they'd last seen bread on the shelves. It wasn't commerce driving these exchanges, it was connection. Neighbors who had once nodded politely now stopped to chat, leaning on shovels or balancing baskets of wood. Their stories wove together like threads in a quilt. One spoke of carrying water for a family whose pipes had burst. Another told of strangers who had guided his children home through snow that rose higher than their heads. And every story carried the same truth. No one had endured alone. The blizzard had turned survival into a communal act, and that was perhaps its greatest legacy. Think about it before the storm. Life in the city had been loud, hurried, anonymous. Crowds pressed shoulder to shoulder, yet few stopped to look each other in the eye. The blizzard changed that. In the silence it forced, in the danger it brought, people rediscovered what it meant to lean on one another. Up above, Samuel and Clara noticed it too. Where once the rooftops had been battlegrounds against the wind, now they were places of quiet observation. They watched as neighbors shoveled each other's stoops, as children shared sleds, and as mothers traded loaves or scarves across windows. The city seemed less like a machine and more like a village stitched together by care. Even the harbor reflected this shift. Sailors, once hardened by routine, spoke softly to one another, lending a hand without being asked. The creak of boats on thawing water sounded almost like music, a song of endurance, of shared burdens lifted just enough to breathe. At night, families gathered by firelight not only to stay warm but to talk. They recounted what they had seen, who had helped them, and what it had felt like to face down nature's fury. Children listened with wide eyes, learning that courage wasn't always loud, and that kindness, even in the smallest gesture, could mean survival. The great blizzard of 1888 froze a city in place, but in that stillness, it also unfroze something deeper: human connection. And maybe, just maybe, that was the lesson hidden in the snow. As the weeks stretched on, the blizzard's fiercest winds had long passed, but its presence lingered in quieter, subtler ways. Snow still clung stubbornly in shaded alleys, stacked in gray ridges along fences and piled high on rooftops where the sun had not yet reached. Icicles dangled like crystal teeth, dripping slowly into gutters, their steady rhythm a reminder of how fragile the line between danger and beauty had been. The city no longer struggled just to move, it now reflected. Conversations shifted from how to survive to what had been learned. In the marketplaces that slowly reopened, people gathered not only to buy, but to share stories. A widow recalled the night a stranger left food at her door without a word. A dock worker described how sailors had lashed themselves together with rope to keep from losing one another in the storm. And children, with laughter that only comes after fear has passed, told and retold how they had tunneled through snowbanks taller than themselves. The echoes of the storm weren't just in the memories. They were in the way people walked more slowly, looking out for one another instead of pushing past. They were in the way hands lingered a little longer in greeting, or how neighbors knocked before heading to bed, just to check if the family next door had enough wood. Even the city's skyline seemed changed. Rooftops scarred, chimneys crooked, railings bent, yet there was dignity in those scars, as though every mark was a badge of survival. Samuel and Clara, once watchers of danger, now became witnesses of renewal. From their rooftop perch, they saw not desperation, but cooperation. They saw parents teaching children how to mend fences, how to dry soaked clothes, how to stack wood for the next winter. Lessons passed quietly, but with an urgency born from experience. Because everyone now knew that storms could return without warning, and preparation meant more than comfort, it meant life. Down by the harbor, the water had opened fully, yet the sailors spoke of ice with new reverence. Some called it an enemy, others a teacher. A captain, grizzled and worn, said it best. The sea reminded us she does not belong to us. We belong to her mercy. And the younger men nodded, understanding something they might never have grasped had the storm not pinned them to the docks. Even the city's leaders, often distant, were humbled. Reports of deaths, stranded trains, and crippled telegraph lines forced them to face uncomfortable truths. The great metropolis had been brought to its knees in days. And while officials argued about tunnels, elevated railways, and underground wires to prevent such paralysis again, the people themselves already knew the deeper answer. Survival didn't rest only in technology, it rested in each other. The echoes of the blizzard would not fade quickly. They lived in the way bread was shared before hunger set in the way blankets were lent without hesitation, and in the way silence fell each time someone said, "Do you remember that night?" The storm had passed, but its story had only begun. When the great blizzard of 1888 finally loosened its grip, New York stood transformed. The storm had not simply buried streets, it had stripped away illusions. For years, the city had believed in its own invincibility, its towers and trolleys, its endless steamships and telegraph wires. Yet in just 3 days of howling wind and snow, all of that was silenced. No trains, no ferries, no reliable communications. For the first time, New Yorkers realized that their proud metropolis, the beating heart of commerce, could be humbled by nature itself. In the weeks that followed, as snowbanks shrank and life crept back into its routines, conversations shifted. Ordinary people asked hard questions. Why had telegraph wires been left strung on fragile poles where ice could snap them like twigs? Why were trains and streetcars left stranded, their passengers forced to sleep in frozen cars with little food? And why had so many ferries been trapped in sheets of ice, leaving workers and families cut off for days? The answers did not come quickly, but the storm forced the city to look inward. Engineers, shaken by the chaos, began sketching ideas for underground tunnels, subways that would not be halted by snowdrifts. Businessmen lobbied for power and telegraph lines to be buried beneath the streets, where wind and ice could not reach them. And politicians, eager to show that such paralysis would never happen again, began speaking of reforms with new urgency. But while officials debated, the people themselves carried the most immediate lessons. Families stored wood more carefully, sealed windows against drafts, and kept extra food tucked away for future winters. Neighbors who had once passed each other with little more than a nod now spoke of storm nights as though they had fought a battle together. Bonds forged in desperation had become friendships rooted in trust. Samuel and Clara, from their rooftop vantage, noticed these small shifts. Where once they had seen frantic motion crowds rushing, carts rattling, ferries booming, they now saw deliberation. People walked slower, more mindful, as if aware that life was fragile and must be protected. Workers paused to share a drink. Women lingered to exchange news, and children skipped through alleys laughing, their games filled with stories of the great snow fortresses they had built when the city was buried. The harbor, too, carried new echoes. Sailors spoke differently about the sea. Where once they boasted of conquering storms, now they admitted a respect for ice, for wind, for the power that had nearly crushed their ships. Some said they would never again set sail without extra provisions, ropes, and a plan for rescue. Even the skyline bore the storm's signature. Leaning telegraph poles and crooked chimneys stood like scars across the city. Yet to many, those scars were not ugly. They were reminders of what had been endured, and of the strength it took to endure it. The blizzard had been cruel, yes. It had taken lives, homes, and livelihoods. But it had also given something back, a shared story, a communal memory, a lesson carved in snow and ice, that survival was not about standing alone, but about standing together. And as spring inched closer, the city carried that memory like a torch, a promise that even in the fiercest storms, New York would not be broken, only reshaped, only reminded, always enduring. By the time March rolled on and the blizzard was only a memory, its impact was still everywhere. The city might have dug itself out, but the storm had left behind questions that couldn't be shoveled away. The Great Blizzard of 1888 wasn't just a storm, it was a turning point. For years, New York had stretched upward, proud of its new telegraph poles, its maze of overhead wires, and the growing forest of cables strung between rooftops. But when the storm came, those very symbols of progress became dangerous traps. Wires snapped under the weight of ice, whipping into streets, sparking fires, and leaving entire blocks in silence. Suddenly, what had once been the future looked fragile. It was ordinary people who saw the need for change most clearly. Merchants who had lost days of business because goods couldn't move. Mothers who had sat in dark rooms, unable to reach a doctor or send word when children fell ill. Workers who had trudged for hours through snow, cursing the tangled mess of useless wires above their heads. Their frustration built into pressure that even politicians couldn't ignore. Within a year, conversations turned to action. City leaders and engineers began serious plans to move telegraph, telephone, and electrical wires underground. It was no small task. The streets would have to be torn up. The costs would be immense, and many companies resisted. But the storm had spoken louder than profit. The people demanded it. The idea of an underground railway, long dismissed as too expensive and too ambitious, suddenly seemed not just possible, but necessary. Trains and streetcars had been stranded in the blizzard, their passengers left freezing for hours. Imagine, reformers argued, if the trains had been beneath the earth, untouched by snow and wind. The dream of a subway system gained momentum, and in that dream was the blueprint of the modern city we know today. And then there was the matter of warnings. The blizzard had struck with brutal speed. Many had gone to bed on a calm Sunday evening and woken to a city swallowed whole. Meteorology was still in its infancy. But now people asked, why hadn't there been better notice? Why had lives been risked for lack of a warning? Out of that outrage came one of the earliest pushes for organized weather forecasting, for systems that could track storms and alert communities before disaster struck. But reforms weren't only political or technical. They were personal. Families who had nearly frozen began storing coal, wood, and food for emergencies. Communities that had learned the cost of isolation began forming tighter bonds, checking in on the elderly and looking after one another more deliberately. Survival had taught them something. Cities often forget that progress means little without care, and that strength is found in connection. Samuel and Clara, standing once more on their rooftop weeks after the blizzard, saw a city changed. Smoke rose again from chimneys, ferries cut across the thawing harbor, and children once more filled the streets with games. But there was something different in the rhythm. People walked not with the old rush of indifference, but with the patience of those who had been humbled, the quiet confidence of those who had endured. And in that patience lay the storm's greatest legacy, the recognition that New York would build smarter, stronger, and kinder, that the snow had not defeated the city, it had reshaped it. When the last drifts finally melted and the streets cleared, New Yorkers were left with a sobering truth. Their proud modern city had been brought to its knees. For all its telegraph poles, electric wires, and horse-drawn streetcars, one storm had shown just how fragile it all was. It wasn't just about lost days of work or frozen rails. It was about trust. Could a city that claimed to lead the nation really be so easily paralyzed? That question didn't just hang in the air, it demanded answers. Engineers, politicians, and ordinary citizens began to look beneath their feet. If snow could bury the surface, maybe the future had to be underground. At first, it sounded absurd. Dig tunnels under the city? Lay tracks where carriages couldn't go? Some mocked the idea, calling it a mole's fantasy. But the memory of abandoned streetcars stuck in snowbanks, their passengers shivering inside, was too vivid to ignore. If trains and trolleys could run beneath the earth, sheltered from blizzards, then New York would never be stranded again. The storm became the silent partner in planning. Meetings at City Hall, filled with debate about subterranean transit. Newspapers that once scoffed at the idea now ran sketches of underground tunnels, promising a future where commerce never stopped, where families could travel in warmth no matter the season. The idea of a subway wasn't born in 1888, but the blizzard made it urgent. Within a decade, the plans that once gathered dust were finally moving forward. And by 1904, New Yorkers were riding the first cars of a system that still defines the city today. The wires that had once whipped through the storm like deadly whips were also condemned. Entire neighborhoods had been cut off because poles toppled or lines snapped. In the aftermath, reformers demanded that wires be buried. It was dangerous, costly, and disruptive to dig up the streets, but the storm had proven the alternative was worse. Slowly, neighborhood by neighborhood, the spaghetti of overhead wires disappeared. What replaced them wasn't just infrastructure, it was a promise of safety. But this wasn't only about technology. The blizzard had carved scars into the people themselves. Families who had shivered in unheated rooms started stockpiling coal, blankets, and food. Merchants who had seen supplies rot in snowbound warehouses began pressing for better storage and delivery systems. Sailors who had fought ice in the harbor told their children stories of courage and survival. Everyone remembered. Everyone adjusted. Even weather itself came under scrutiny. Before 1888, forecasts were little more than guesswork, scattered notes sent by telegraph. But now, after so many lives were lost to a storm that struck without warning, Americans demanded something better. Out of this tragedy, modern forecasting began to take shape. Networks of observers, early systems of alerts, the seed of the science we rely on today. In the end, the Great Blizzard of 1888 didn't just bury New York, it forced it to grow up. The storm turned a city of surface wires and horse-drawn cars into a city of underground subways and safer streets. It turned scattered guesses about the weather into the beginnings of meteorology. And perhaps most importantly, it turned strangers into neighbors, teaching them that survival meant more than endurance. It meant looking out for one another. For Samuel and Clara, watching from their rooftop weeks later, the streets no longer seemed the same. They saw workmen digging, families storing coal, and merchants organizing supplies. They saw resilience not in speeches, but in shovels, in lamps relit, in children laughing once again in alleys cleared of snow. They saw a city determined never to be caught so unprepared again. The blizzard was over, but its lessons were just beginning. When the last patches of ice had melted and the streets no longer echoed with the crunch of boots on snow, the city seemed almost unchanged on the surface. Horses clattered along Broadway again, merchants reopened their shops, and ferries resumed their slow glide across the harbor. But beneath that return to normalcy, nothing was quite the same. The Great Blizzard of 1888 had carved itself into memory with a force that no thaw could erase. Families who had huddled in darkened tenements never forgot the sting of breath turning to frost indoors. Shopkeepers who had rationed bread or shared soup with neighbors spoke of those long nights for the rest of their lives. Children who had pressed hands to icy windows remembered the silence of a city buried, a silence so deep it seemed to stretch forever. The storm left more than stories. It changed the city's bones. Engineers pushed harder for underground transit, no longer a dream but a necessity. The subway, when it finally opened years later, carried with it the fingerprints of that storm. The underground was not built merely for speed or convenience. It was born of fear and of a promise that New York would never again be paralyzed by snow. The storm also rewrote the skyline in small ways. Wires once strung carelessly above streets began to vanish, tucked safely underground. Telephone lines, telegraph wires, and electrical cables, all driven below the surface, after too many snapped in the blizzard and turned into whips of ice and fire. What once looked like progress, messy and proud against the sky, now seemed reckless. The storm had stripped away illusions of invincibility. But the most lasting change wasn't steel or stone. It was people. Neighbors who once kept to themselves began knocking on doors when a storm cloud gathered. Families stored extra coal, bread, and blankets, not only for their own survival, but for the family next door. Sailors taught their apprentices how to read the sky more carefully. Mothers passed down stories to their children, not just of fear, but of courage, of sharing, of singing lullabies loud enough to drown the wind. The Great Blizzard became part of New York's folklore, a story told in kitchens, schools, and even taverns. "Do you remember '88?" became a phrase that carried weight, much like, "Do you remember the war?" or "Do you remember the flood?" It was a marker in time, a before and after. And maybe that was the true legacy. Not just that New York rebuilt, but that New York remembered. Because storms will always come. The city would face blackouts, floods, hurricanes, and more blizzards in the years ahead. But 1888 had taught its people that survival was not only about endurance. It was about learning, adapting, and carrying those lessons forward. As Samuel and Clara watched children playing once more in the softened snowbanks weeks later, they didn't just see laughter. They saw resilience. They saw the city's heartbeat restored, steadier than before, stronger because it had been tested. The harbor's waves lapped calmly against the piers. Ferries moved with slow determination, and the smoke rising from chimneys curled peacefully into a clear sky. The storm had passed, but the story it wrote on New York's heart remained, reminding every generation after, even in the coldest, darkest nights, there is warmth to be found in courage, in community, and in the quiet endurance of a city that refuses to break. When the Great Blizzard finally loosened its grip, New Yorkers carried on with their daily lives. Horses pulled carts again, ferries crossed the East River, and the clang of streetcars returned. Yet under that familiar rhythm, the storm's memory whispered in every corner. It was not something people simply forgot. It lingered like a scar. Old men in taverns would sit by the stove and say, "You should have seen the drifts on Broadway, taller than a man," while their friends nodded with quiet gravity. Mothers reminded their children each winter to keep extra blankets close, their voices softened by the memory of nights when firelight was all that stood between warmth and frostbite. And sailors who had survived the harbor's frozen grip used that storm as their reference point for every danger afterward. If the mast creaked, if the rigging groaned, they compared it to '88, because nothing else matched its fury. But the blizzard didn't only shape memories, it reshaped the city's future. In the years that followed, debates about New York's infrastructure took on new urgency. The storm had exposed the city's fragility in a way no politician could ignore. Telegraph wires had snapped like twigs. Power lines had collapsed under the weight of ice, setting fires that burned homes already frozen in darkness. Families had been trapped because roads vanished under snow. The blizzard had revealed how a modern city could be brought to its knees overnight. And so came the great push to bury wires underground. What had once been dismissed as too expensive now seemed like common sense. Engineers began planning with renewed determination, knowing another storm of that magnitude would come eventually. The subway, too, gained momentum. The idea of an underground system, safe from snow and ice, suddenly became not just visionary, but necessary. In that sense, you could say that 1888 dug the first shovel of dirt for New York's subway system. Still, beyond steel and stone, it was people who carried the storm's legacy most vividly. In neighborhoods where survival had depended on kindness, those bonds endured. Families who once had been strangers now greeted one another by name. Shopkeepers who had handed out bread freely found loyal customers for life. Children who had been carried across snowbanks by neighbors grew up with a sense of duty to help others. Isn't that what storms really do? They test not only our roofs and walls, but our hearts. In the aftermath, many recalled not just the cold, but the warmth, small acts of humanity that glowed brighter against the backdrop of snow. A shared loaf of bread, a hand steadying a traveler, a lullaby sung through the roar of the wind. These became the true stories of the Great Blizzard of 1888. The city healed, yes, but it also remembered. And in remembering, it grew stronger. Newspapers in the days after the blizzard read like dispatches from a battlefield. Headlines shouted words like calamity, city paralyzed, and frozen in time. Editors scrambled to capture the scale of it, but even their ink seemed too weak for the truth. One paper described drifts as high as third-story windows, while another told of travelers frozen in place, discovered days later like statues of ice. Readers gasped at the images painted in print. Yet for those who lived through it, no description could ever equal the experience. Personal diaries and letters from that week bring us even closer. One schoolteacher in Brooklyn wrote about lighting her last candle, while children huddled around her desk for warmth. Their little faces, she wrote, looked like porcelain under the glow. A sailor stranded in the East River compared the frozen water to a field of shattered glass stretching to the horizon. And in a tenement on the Lower East Side, a mother recorded how she boiled water 3 times a day, just to hold the steam against her children's cheeks, to trick them into thinking they were warmer than they really were. The New York Times ran stories of horses buried in snowbanks, wagons abandoned in the middle of the avenues, and men tunneling through drifts with kitchen shovels to rescue neighbors. The Evening Post published a letter from a reader who wrote, "The silence is the strangest thing. The city, usually alive with noise, is muffled as if the world itself is holding its breath." That line captured what so many felt, the eerie hush of a metropolis forced into stillness. But these voices also revealed courage. A young telegraph operator described trudging through waist-high snow to reach his office, only to find the lines sagging uselessly. Instead of going home, he stayed, relaying messages by hand to anyone who reached him. His notes helped families reunite, and though few remembered his name, his effort became part of the storm's hidden heroism. There were bitter voices, too. Merchants who lost entire stocks of produce, ruined by frost, filled columns with anger toward city officials. "Where were the plows?" one wrote. Why were we left to dig ourselves out like peasants? Others scolded the wealthy, who, sheltered in brownstones with roaring fires, seemed untouched, while the poor froze in drafty rooms. The blizzard didn't just expose New York's weakness in infrastructure, it exposed the deep divide between privilege and poverty. And yet, through it all, there was resilience in the words left behind. Survivors wrote not just of hardship, but of a strange beauty, the way icicles sparkled like glass chandeliers, or how the city, stripped of noise, felt like a cathedral of snow. Even in suffering, they found poetry. So when we look back on the blizzard of 1888, it isn't just the numbers, the deaths, the inches of snow, the lost fortunes that endure. It's the voices, those hurried scrawls in diaries, the newspaper sketches, the personal letters folded into trunks. They give us more than facts. They give us the heartbeat of a city that suffered, endured, and somehow grew stronger. In the years that followed, New York City made sure the lessons of the Great Blizzard of 1888 would not be forgotten. The storm had stripped the city bare, showing its weaknesses in the most unforgiving way. Wires strung above the streets had snapped like fragile twigs. Trolleys and trains had frozen in place. People had died simply because the city wasn't prepared. And so, change came. Out of that winter's devastation grew the decision to bury power and telegraph lines underground, where storms could not tear them down. The idea of a subway system, long debated, suddenly seemed urgent, and within a generation, New Yorkers were traveling beneath the streets instead of depending only on carriages or elevated tracks vulnerable to the weather. The storm, in its cruelty, pushed the city forward into modernity. But beyond the rails and the wires, the blizzard of '88 left another legacy, one harder to measure, yet just as real. It revealed that in moments of crisis, New Yorkers leaned on one another. Strangers became rescuers. Neighbors became family. Diaries, newspapers, and letters all echo the same theme. Kindness was as vital as firewood. Courage as necessary as bread. Samuel and Clara, the rooftop watchers we've followed through this story, might never have had their names written into history books, but their quiet care, their watchful eyes, and their small acts of vigilance belong to the same tapestry as every unsung hero of that storm. They remind us that resilience is rarely loud. More often, it is quiet, steady, and shared. Tonight, as we close this story, picture the city finally thawing, the snowbanks shrinking into rivulets that glisten under spring light. Imagine neighbors exchanging smiles as doors open wide again. Children playing in puddles where snow once towered, and workers lifting their tools with cautious hope. Life went on, steadier, wiser, and with a deeper sense of connection. And for us, more than a century later, the lesson still lingers. Disasters will come, storms will rise, but in the end, what carries us through is not just strength, it's compassion, patience, and the quiet ways we look after one another. So as you settle into your own night, let this story of survival and resilience rest with you. May it bring you calm. May it remind you that even in the harshest winters of life, warmth always returns. Thank you for sharing this journey through the great blizzard of 1888 with me. Sleep peacefully. Let your mind drift as gently as falling snow, and may your dreams be filled with light, warmth, and the quiet strength of resilience. Good night, and I'll see you in the next story.